The National Energy Board today gave its approval to the expansion of the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain pipeline, but it attached 157 conditions to the approval, including 49 environmental requirements. Now, the company must meet the conditions if it wants to go ahead with the $6.8 billion project to triple the capacity of the pipeline, carrying diluted bitumen from the Alberta oil sands to Burnaby, British Columbia for export. The federal government now has 7 months to make a final decision on the project, so what should that decision be? Let's bring in 3 members of Parliament for their views on this controversial pipeline project. Kim Rudd is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Natural Resources. Alberta MP Chris Warkentin is here for the official opposition. And Peter Julian is the House Leader for the NDP and also happens to represent the riding of New Westminster Burnaby, which is critically linked to this project. And good to see you all. Thanks for being here to talk to me about this decision today from the National Energy Board. Kim Rudd, how does the government view this recommendation from the NEB that the Kinder Morgan expansion should go ahead as long as these 157 conditions are met?
Well, Peter, we've received the report, as you know, and within that report are 157 conditions that the proponent is required to respond to back to the NEB. As you know, the minister struck a panel earlier this week with 3 well-respected Western Canadians to also have consultations and discussions along the proposed route with Indigenous communities as well as other communities. And there's also going to be an online portal where Canadians can go in and say what they think, as well as request other information. And there's a process that's being followed that is yet to finish its course.
All right, Chris Warkentin, what's your reaction to this ruling today as an Alberta MP that your province said today, the NDP leader, that Premier Rachel Notley said this is a good project, should go ahead. I'm assuming you agree with her?
Absolutely. It's a fantastic project. It's one that will ensure that people in my province are going to be able to get back to work. What we do know is that over the last number of months, we've seen hundreds of thousands of people lose their employment. We've seen massive layoffs, and in the energy sector, this is a glimmer of hope for those people employed in that sector. And I think that it's important that the government expedite the process now and ensure that the approval can move ahead. What we're concerned about is this ongoing consultation after consultation after consultation. The NEB undertakes a science-based assessment. They have brought forward recommendations. The recommendation is to go ahead. We support that recommendation.
Peter Julian, so we have a recommendation now from the NEB. As long as these 157 conditions are met, including engineering, safety, environmental, emergency preparedness conditions, including holding $1.1 billion in liability coverage and detailing any plans to reduce and offset emissions. Any of that satisfy you?
Well, Peter, as you know, we've raised concerns about the process the whole time. I mean, I am out of the energy sector, worked in an oil refinery that's now closed in Burnaby, British Columbia. And so when we talk about energy policy, we actually need to have something that is sound to put into place that gets the social license that is required. Now, the Conservatives ripped apart the NEB process, so communities couldn't be consulted, and that social license was impossible. The Liberals committed during the election campaign to start a new process, and I think a lot of people voted for them on that basis, and then they were cruelly hoaxed because the government has just really applied window dressing. A few weeks of a small committee that will go around and basically establish whatever criteria needs to go with the NEB recommendation. I can tell you my constituents in Burnaby and people right across the Lower Mainland feel that they haven't been consulted because the Conservative process took them out of the process. They weren't able to speak. They weren't able to go forward, make their views known, and a lot of cities and municipalities are reacting as a result. What that means is, ultimately, that those communities that feel that they weren't even allowed into the process will end up taking this process to court. And I don't think that helps anybody.
Here's what the board said in its decision today, at least in part. Taking into account all the evidence, considering all relevant factors, and given that there are considerable benefits nationally, regionally, and to some extent locally, some degree locally, the board found that the benefits of the project would outweigh the residual burdens. So Kim Rudd, talk to me about, so if the NEB has concluded this, what is this review committee supposed to look at?
Well, Peter, as we've said all along, we need to restore the confidence of Canadians in the process, and that is why there has been no major pipeline in the last 10 years built to Tidewater.
That's nonsense.
And what we have said is this panel, which will begin its work on June 1st, will conclude its work on November 1st with a report to the minister. And we have heard over and over that, just as Peter Julian has said, there are communities who don't feel that they were consulted, and certainly a number of Indigenous peoples have made that very clear to us. So this is an opportunity for them indeed to be heard. And the social license piece is crucial to getting any of these major projects built. It's our responsibility as a government to help get our resources to market, and that's exactly what we're doing.
So, Mr. Warkentin, the point of both of your colleagues here is that the NEB has issued a recommendation, but it comes under a flawed process. The people weren't heard under the process, and the Liberals say they will be heard now. What's your response?
Well, I think that's kind of ridiculous, and I think that I would agree with Peter that the Liberals are now trying to put on a political window dressing to the process, but I believe that the process is correct. The process was a science-based assessment. It was an assessment of the technical aspects of this project. It also incorporated the views of those people, the communities that would be affected by this project, to be involved in the conversation. And so this was undertaken. There's recommendation. The recommendation is to go forward, obviously, with conditions to ensure the health and safety of all Canadians. I think it's time to put aside the Liberals' ongoing consulting on the consultations and ongoing with a discussion of which really doesn't add to the assessment of the project. What we do need to have is this project go ahead to create jobs and opportunity and prosperity for the province of Alberta, for those people living in British Columbia, and really all Canadians.
Mr. Julian, there are clearly some fierce opposition to the project. I think you talked a little bit about it. Opposition from Indigenous and environmental groups who claim they weren't heard. The province of British Columbia, the cities of Vancouver and Burnaby. So I guess what happens now, do you have confidence now that if it's revisited by this panel, who is it you want them to talk to? What is it you want them to hear?
Well, first off, they don't claim to not being heard. They were not heard. They were shut out by the Conservative changes to the process. So communities were simply thrown aside. So what happens ultimately is when you have a process that doesn't have credibility in the eyes of communities, those communities go to court. That's certainly what we've seen with Northern Gateway as well. So we're going to see a lot of litigation. It was a failed process under the Conservatives, but the Liberals are continuing that same process and just adding a little window dressing and a few weeks of a panel that travels around. It may make people after the fact feel a little bit better that somebody actually listens to them, but the reality is the recommendation comes out of a Conservative process, and all the Liberals are doing is adding on some suggestions around social license. Social license comes from having a process that people can actually feel that they're involved in, and that has not happened under the Conservatives or the Liberals.
Okay, well, here's what they also said today in their recommendations. The conditions also include consulting with a number of Indigenous groups about environmental protection and emergency response plans. Here's what the board said. The board considered the concerns expressed by Indigenous groups, how the project and related tanker traffic could impact Indigenous interests, and the appropriate means of mitigating such impacts. So they're saying they were heard, and their concerns have been considered. Kim Rudd, what's your view of that? Does the government take the position that people were heard or weren't heard?
Well, Peter, we're going on the basis of what communities are telling us, the Indigenous peoples as well as communities along the proposed route. We understand that communities are hurting because of the low resource prices. We understand the importance of getting those resources to market, but it has to be done right. And when you have proponents communities along the proposed route saying they haven't been heard, it's our responsibility to make sure that they are heard. And as on or before December 19th, a decision will be made on the pipeline.
Okay. Mr. Warkentin, what do you want to hear from the government now as this process moves forward? What do you think this committee's job is going to be, and what do you think they're likely to rule?
Well, what I do want to hear from the government is that they understand the plight of those people that have lost their jobs over the last number of months. Hundreds of thousands of people have been out of work that are looking for some glimmer of hope, and this government is giving them just more assurances of more consultations, which is very concerning. It doesn't build confidence into the system. I think what I want to hear from the Liberals is after a science-based assessment, after having consulted with organizations and with stakeholders and with the communities that these pipelines run through over the last number of years, that the Liberals will actually take that recommendation, run with it, and actually allow for a project to put people to work. This is a project that's ready and willing, and it's a private sector solution to the job losses that we've seen. What people in Alberta don't want is more handouts. What they want is a job. They want an opportunity and a possibility of long-term prosperity for our province. We know that is the hope of all Western Canadians and certainly every Canadian.
All right, Mr. Julian, give a final word to you here.
Well, communities needed to be consulted, and anyone who knows the Lower Mainland knows that ultimately what Trans Mountain is proposing as the port area, given the tides and given the tightness of the fjord that is there, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, if there had been a real consultation process, I think that is one of the things that would have come out through the consultation process that would have made a difference in terms of the NEB recommendations. For example, changing routes and looking at a different approach on pipelines. That hasn't happened because the Conservatives gutted all of that community consultation. And for the Liberals to continue the same process and just add a little window dressing a few weeks during the summer when people many of them are out of town, to sort of have some brief meetings and have a report on how social license can be obtained after the fact. I think most British Columbians would say you get the social license before, not after approving it and pushing it through. And the fear of many British Columbians is that that's what the Liberal government intends to do.
All right.
That report that's coming from the panel will be considered along with the NEB report in the final decision.
But for social license, it's not a change in the NEB recommendation.
All right. So, Kim Rudd, based on that report, so the government could, at the end of the day, it's the government's priority. The government could say no to the project, even though the NDP's recommended yes. Your panel can't overrule the NEB, but the government could, right?
The NEB panel is in and of itself doing its job, and will provide an independent report that will be considered along with the NEB report with a decision on or before December 19th.
Okay. We'll continue to see where that story takes us. Thank you all for your time tonight. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Peter.
Thanks,
Thank
Peter.
you.
Thank you.